The snow settling on the ruined tree line outside Aachen looked almost peaceful, at least in the few seconds before the horizon erupted into coordinated American fire. Oberleutnant Karl Fortmann, huddled in the cupola of his Panzer IV, had no time to make sense of it. One moment, the battlefield was quiet. The next, American tanks he hadn't even spotted were turning their turrets in perfect unison, as if guided by a single invisible hand. He slammed his fist against the cold steel rim, cursing the clumsy U.S. command structure he had been taught to ridicule. According to every briefing he had ever received, American armored formations were supposed to stumble, bicker, drown in their own radio clutter. They were, his colonel had said, a mob of machines run by amateurs. But nothing on this field looked like a mob. Within 30 seconds, the Shermans were repositioning with the precision he would have expected only from German armor drilling under ideal conditions, and even then, not this quickly. Orders were clearly moving through them like electricity. Platoons pivoted, hulls shifted, guns elevated, fire missions synchronized. Artillery struck the exact hedgerow German infantry had used for cover only moments earlier, as if the Americans had already memorized every fold of the terrain. Karl's loader muttered, half in awe, half in dread, "It's like they all know what the others are doing." He wasn't wrong. But the truth was even more terrifying than what the German crew imagined. Miles away, the American battalion commander wasn't shouting through a maze of incompatible frequencies or trying to guess where his armored companies had ended up. He was calmly issuing updates through a clean, crystal-controlled FM network, one in which every single Sherman, every scout car, every tank destroyer, and every artillery liaison vehicle was a fully interoperable node. His voice, crisp and unmistakable, reached his tank commanders without static, without overlap, without the chaotic crosstalk that German officers routinely fought against. His units weren't waiting on couriers. They weren't guessing. They weren't hoping clarity would break through the fog of AM distortion. They were, instead, acting as a single distributed organism. To Karl Fortmann, the synchronized American maneuver looked like witchcraft. To U.S. crews, it was simply the normal result of turning the Sherman fleet into a continent-spanning communications web. German generals had wargamed a dozen permutations of American strategy. They had studied U.S. armor doctrine, mocked its theoretical flaws, and prepared countermeasures to expected confusion. They believed the Americans lacked the discipline and culture to execute battlefield command with speed. They believed the U.S. Army, expanded too fast and led by too many reservists, would crack under stress. They believed technology played a minor role compared to feeling the battlefield, the way German officers were trained to do. And they believed, firmly, that radios were merely accessories. Useful, yes, but not decisive. They were wrong, on every count. Because by 1944, the United States had deployed a communication system so far ahead of anything Germany possessed that it didn't simply improve command and control, it rewired the very shape of armored warfare. Every Sherman had become a functioning node in a battlefield-wide FM network, able to send and receive clean signals under conditions where German AM radios dissolved into noise. Every American platoon leader carried a device that let him talk directly to artillery without relays. Scout elements could report and reroute entire tank companies in minutes. And, most importantly, U.S. armored commanders could maneuver at a tempo that German units, no matter how elite, could not match. The Germans had expected chaos. What they encountered was a machine. These early encounters formed the shock that would ripple up the entire German command structure. Reports poured in describing American tank formations reacting with impossibly short delay. Infantry-tank coordination unlike anything ever observed. Fire missions called with unnatural speed, and armored pushes that seemed to think faster than any staff could calculate. What Germany interpreted as uncanny American intuition was, in fact, the cold precision of frequency modulation. The battlefield wasn't being guided by gut feeling. It was being guided by technology. And in that instant near Aachen, as the Shermans regrouped with machine-like efficiency, Karl Fortmann realized an unforgiving truth. This war would not be decided by superior gunnery tables or elegant combined arms doctrine. It would not be won by the sharper tank silhouettes or the thicker armor plating. It would not hinge on which side fielded the more heroic commanders. It would be decided by the invisible architecture of communication, a domain where Germany still believed its experience outweighed American innovation, and where the United States had quietly built a technological revolution that the German High Command had failed to anticipate. The war of steel was still being fought, but the war of signals had already been decided. Bevor amerikanische Tanks bekamen synchronisierte Instrumente von Battlefield-Choreografie, bevor German Officers begannen wispern über Impossible Reaction Times, und bevor Allied Fire Missions gained die ihrige Präzision, das schien zu defieren Physik, da war eine tiefere Story, eine, die streckte far beyond den Frontlines. Es begann nicht mit einem Tank Commander auf dem Western Front, sondern in den Fabriken, Laboratorien und Assembly Lines einer Nation, das tretete Kommunikationstechnologie nicht als einen Accessoire zu War, sondern als es Blutstrom. Zu German Generälen, der Konzept von Every Tank possessing eine reliable radio war eine theoretische Luxus. Für die Vereinigten Staaten, es bekam eine Massproduktionscommitment. Eins exekutiert mit derselben Ferozität, es appliete zu bilden Engines, Hulls und Guns. The American war machine approached battlefield communication as a problem of scale. If seamless coordination required every Sherman to carry a crystal-controlled FM radio, then the only acceptable answer was simply to build them, in unprecedented quantities. The U.S. Signal Corps had already determined by 1942 that AM radios, the standard used across most German armored forces, were no longer sufficient for the increasingly fluid, fast-moving battlefields of modern mechanized war. AM sets distorted under stress, bled into adjacent frequencies, and produced static when tanks moved or fired. Frequency drift made unit-level coordination unreliable. German crews often fought with radios that crackled, faded, or fell silent at the worst possible moment. Platoons frequently reverted to flags or couriers, anachronisms in a war defined by acceleration. The Americans looked at that vulnerability and decided to eliminate it entirely. Factories from New Jersey to Indiana began rolling out frequency-modulated sets like the SCR-508 and SCR-528, engineered to maintain clarity even while a tank tore across uneven terrain. Unlike AM rigs that relied on manual tuning, FM sets used crystal control, locking each radio to an exact, stable frequency. This single engineering choice meant that American tank commanders speaking to one another sounded as if they were in the same room, even when separated by smoke, gunfire, and half a kilometer of churned mud. But the technological leap alone wasn't the decisive factor. What truly stunned German analysts was the scale at which the United States deployed it. By late 1943, American production lines were outputting FM radios almost as fast as they built the tanks themselves. Every Sherman leaving the assembly line already carried a full communication suite. Every half-track, every armored scout car, even artillery liaison jeeps were equipped with them. It was a level of standardization the German industrial system could not replicate. Shackled as it was by chronic shortages, fragmented production, and the eternal tug-of-war between competing design bureaus. Germany struggled to supply even basic AM sets to all of its armored units. Many Panzer IV and Panther formations entered combat with only the platoon leader radio equipped, Wingmen followed by line of sight alone. In contrast, the Americans equipped not just every tank, but every commander inside those tanks, an exponential multiplication of battlefield awareness. U.S. industry treated radios the same way it treated rations or ammunition, as fundamental, not optional. What made this possible was not simply the existence of factories, but the uniquely American concept of industrial redundancy. German plants were vulnerable to disruption. Many components were handcrafted, calibrated individually, and dependent on specialized labor. Destroy a single transformer manufacturer and half the radio supply chain dissolved. American FM sets were built from interchangeable, mass-produced modules that could be assembled by workers who had never seen a radio before the war. The U.S. had embraced industrial decentralization long before it became a military necessity. When one plant suffered delays, another absorbed the workload. When engineers redesigned a radio chassis for easier assembly, the change spread through the entire production chain in weeks, not months. The Germans could not understand how their enemies' factories recovered from setbacks with such startling speed. The answer was simple. The system itself was designed to grow under pressure. And while German engineers often produced ingenious equipment, their own production systems suffocated that ingenuity. Germany's communication industry remained fractured, locked behind bureaucratic rivalries, and starved by shortages in copper, vacuum tubes, and skilled labor. Radios were assembled in small batches, each one requiring hours of adjustment. To field a battalion's worth of reliable radios was a minor miracle. The Americans fielded tens of thousands as an afterthought. This gap in production capability produced an illusion at the front. German soldiers interpreted American coherence as evidence of extraordinary discipline or supernatural organizational talent. They whispered among themselves that U.S. commanders must be receiving privileged intelligence or deploying some unknown reconnaissance trick. They speculated that American tankers had rehearsed every battlefield dozens of times. They could not conceive that the true explanation was something as mundane and as devastating as supply chains. The Americans didn't outperform the Germans because they thought faster. They outperformed them because they could talk faster. The U.S. also understood something the German high command never fully appreciated. The more radios existed on the battlefield, the more valuable each individual radio became. A single tank with FM clarity improved the effectiveness of the crew. A platoon with FM clarity changed the tempo of maneuver warfare. A battalion with FM clarity altered the entire structure of armored doctrine. And when every tank in the formation could speak to every other tank with minimal static, minimal delay, and minimal confusion, the battlefield transformed into something qualitatively different, something fundamentally modern. Industrial abundance made strategic possibilities the Germans couldn't imagine. American armored divisions could rearrange themselves in real time, repositioning companies like pieces on a board, because the communication infrastructure allowed it. Artillery units could receive fire missions from tank commanders in seconds because they shared a radio language. Air support could be redirected mid-flight because pilots and ground units recognized each other instantly on the same FM channels. This wasn't just having radios. It was creating a nervous system. To German analysts, the U.S. command grid appeared almost supernatural because it changed the very speed at which decisions could be made. German orders often traveled down a chain that required interpretation, restatement, and considerable guesswork. American orders traveled at the speed of voice, uncorrupted by noise, delay, or technical failure. Where German battalion commanders often hesitated, waiting for confirmation across unreliable channels, U.S. commanders acted. Speed became a weapon, and FM radios were the engine. Behind every Sherman moving with unnatural coherence, behind every rapid-fire mission that felt like it fell from the sky the moment an American tanker requested it, behind every coordinated armored thrust that seemed to violate conventional doctrine, there existed an industrial decision made years before to build more radios more reliably, more consistently than any enemy could counter. The Germans expected confusion. The Americans gave them clarity on an industrial scale. In the end, the U.S. didn't win the communication war because it had better radios. It won because it had enough of them, and because it had the industrial philosophy to ensure every tank, every platoon, every maneuverable element became a living part of a continent-wide FM organism. When German officers finally realized this, it wasn't awe they felt. FM-FM-Radios waren die Nerven eines neukampfartigen Warfares, dann Logistik war der Blutstrom, das kehrte diese Nerven am Leben. Technologie allein kann nicht eine Kampagne gewinnen, nicht wenn Radios, Sperrparts, Power-Units, Antennensektionen, wasserfeste Hausungen, Träne-Operatoren und Service-Crews kapabel sind, tausende Sets funktionieren in einem Environment definiert durch Vibration, Mutt, Kalt und Chaos. Der FM-Revolution dient nicht so simply, weil die Vereinigten Staaten Radios bauten. Es succeeded, weil die Vereinigten Staaten konnte sie sustainen. Zu deutschen Kommandanten der Idee, dass every Sherman operierte als eine voll integrierte Kommunikationsnode, seemed improbable, nicht nur von einer technologischen Standpunkt, sondern von einer logistischen eine. Maintaining even a fraction of such a network required resources that the Reich could not have concentrated even in its strongest year. German armored units oft hatten zu kannibalisieren broken radios ein Handvoll funktionieren. Tank crews were trained to accept communications failure as inevitable, and supply officers frequently issued dire warnings. If your set fails, do not expect a replacement. In contrast, American divisions carried spare FM radios the way they carried spare road wheels. It was routine, expected, a part of the rhythm of the war. Every tank battalion had signal corps maintenance teams embedded within it, soldiers whose entire purpose was to ensure the network never fell silent. Trucks moved forward with crates of vacuum tubes, insulation kits, microphones, headsets, tuning crystals, and power amplifiers. Supply officers could requisition new sets and receive them within days, not months. This difference in sustainment created a difference in battlefield reliability that German intelligence initially refused to believe. German crews knew their own radios would degrade after a few hours of intense operation. Heat warped components, vibrations loosened screws. AM circuits drifted off frequency. But captured American sets? They just worked. Even after being shaken inside a Sherman bouncing across shattered French roads, the FM units maintained clarity. Even after weeks without depot-level servicing, the signal remained stable. German technicians dismantled these sets and marveled at the ruggedness of the components. Connectors that locked firmly into place, standardized tubes, dust-proof housings, shock-mounted chassis designed to survive impacts that would have destroyed German sets. But the true shock came from the field manuals. The United States Army had created a maintenance system in which frontline crews could replace almost every module of the radio themselves. Panels were marked. Connectors were intuitive. Circuit boards could be pulled and swapped in minutes. If a Sherman's radio failed during combat, crews could restore it between firefights. And if a tank was knocked out, U.S. signalmen recovered its radio within hours, refurbished it, and delivered it to another vehicle. Nothing was wasted, nothing was irreplaceable, and nothing was allowed to remain silent. This ensured that American FM coverage remained dense across every battlefield. A commander rarely encountered a gap in communication because any breakdown was corrected before it could cascade into systemic failure. German units, by contrast, often suffered from communication blackouts that lasted days, sometimes weeks. A battalion without radios was functionally blind, left to interpret battlefield noise and hope discipline compensated for ignorance. Discipline, however, cannot substitute for information. As American armored divisions raced across France in the summer of 1944, their communication grid expanded with them. Supply convoys carried not just fuel and ammunition, but entire stocks of spare radios. Forward signal depots leapfrogged behind advancing columns, establishing repair stations within hours of ground being taken. The U.S. Army had perfected a form of logistical momentum in which communication infrastructure advanced as fast as the tanks themselves. For Germany, this was incomprehensible. For the United States, it was doctrine. The FM advantage manifested in ways the German high command struggled to quantify. Reports described American fire missions being called at a pace beyond human capability. Infantry units claimed that American tank thrusts changed direction like schools of fish. Captured crewmen insisted that U.S. commanders must have had pre-laid communication lines hidden underground. No other explanation made sense to them. But the explanation was not hidden. It was on the roads, thousands upon thousands of supply trucks, each carrying the physical backbone of the FM network. The Americans treated communication gear as consumables, prepared to replace entire sets at the first sign of degradation. The Germans treated theirs as heirlooms, precious objects to be guarded because they could not be easily replenished. The U.S. Army could afford to saturate the battlefield with redundant radios. The Wehrmacht could not afford to lose a single one. This disparity drove a deeper strategic advantage. The Americans could maintain a coherent operational picture across distances that German generals assumed would fracture U.S. command. Even when supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, even when armored thrusts outpaced maps, even when frontline commanders advanced beyond expectations, the FM network held. It held because spare parts were everywhere. It held because replacements were always available. It held because the U.S. Army treated communication reliability as sacred. One overlooked detail reveals the magnitude of this advantage. American fuel convoys carried spare radio parts explicitly because signal reliability was considered as vital as mobility. German officers did not understand this mindset. In their system, fuel determined mobility. Communication merely directed it. In the American system, fuel and communication were inseparable. A tank without fuel was a static bunker. A tank without communication was a stray projectile. But while fuel shortages crippled German mechanized warfare, the U.S. suffered no such collapse in communication capacity. On the contrary, the more the Americans advanced, the stronger their FM network became. Signal battalions established mobile transmission hubs. Antenna trucks extended range. Liaison aircraft relayed messages. And every new armored unit plugging into the grid reinforced the density of the communication web. It was a paradox that German officers failed to grasp. The larger the American force grew, the more coherent it became. German doctrine assumed that scale naturally produced chaos. American logistics proved the opposite, that scale, supported by abundance, created order. The more radios the Americans deployed, the stronger the network. The more tanks they fielded, the faster they could coordinate. The longer the supply line stretched, the more opportunities to reinforce communication reliability. What German generals had expected to be America's greatest weakness, its massive, heterogeneous army, became its greatest strength, because logistics turned quantity into quality. And nowhere was this more evident than in the FM grid humming across the Western Front. Through this logistical backbone, the Americans achieved something the Germans considered impossible, a mechanized force that grew more synchronized under strain, not less. The Germans prepared for confusion. The Americans prepared for continuity, and logistics ensured they always had it. Zu dem High Command,
Technologie hat alleweis bin eine Matte auf Ingenieurseleganz, präzise Optik, meticulously machined Komponenten und battlefield craftsmanship honed by decades of doctrine. But in the American war machine, Technologie served a different purpose. It was not meant to be admired. It was meant to scale. And nowhere did that philosophy collide more violently with German assumptions than in the U.S. mastery of frequency-modulated battlefield communication. For German officers trained in the interwar years, the assumption was simple. Command superiority came from superior commanders. A well-trained officer corps, drilled to think independently, was expected to make faster, more decisive choices than any technological infrastructure could support. The battlefield was a chessboard of human intuition. Radios were helpful, yes, but subordinate to leadership. And then the Americans introduced a battlefield where leadership flowed through a signal architecture so advanced it fundamentally altered what leadership meant. At the heart of this architecture was the shift from amplitude modulation to frequency modulation, a shift the Germans dismissed as unnecessary before the war and continued to misunderstand deep into 1944. AM radios were susceptible to atmospheric noise, electrical interference, overlapping transmissions, and catastrophic frequency drift under vibration. German engineers knew this, but they considered these limitations acceptable. War, after all, was messy. Radios went quiet. Messages repeated. Orders were misheard. That was simply the nature of combat. The Americans refused to accept this nature. U.S. engineers realized that FM technology, though harder to develop initially, offered one decisive advantage: clarity under chaos. FM signals rejected static. They remained crisp under shock. They could transmit intelligible voice traffic while a Sherman's engine roared at full throttle or while its cannon recoiled violently. And because FM sets used crystal-controlled tuning, units stayed locked on frequency with mathematical precision. This alone would have given the Americans an advantage. But the breakthrough was not FM itself. It was how they integrated FM into the entire structure of combat. Every Sherman commander could now communicate as cleanly as a staff officer in a headquarters bunker. Platoon leaders could issue orders without repeating themselves. Artillery observers could speak in natural voice cadence, unaffected by environmental noise. Air-ground coordination became reliable, not occasionally, not conditionally, but reliably. And tactical dispersion, normally a recipe for communication breakdown, became not just possible, but preferable. The Germans had spent years perfecting armored tactics based on proximity, line of sight, and pre-briefed coordination. The Americans were now coordinating across kilometers with the ease of a conversation. What astonished German analysts most was the emergence of a phenomenon they had never anticipated: the distributed tactical brain. Because every Sherman held an FM radio, and because every FM radio could speak without distortion, information flowed horizontally across U.S. armored formations. A tank commander spotting enemy armor could warn the entire platoon in real time. A scout car detecting a flanking threat could redirect an entire company within minutes. Artillery could receive fire corrections almost instantaneously, not through a chain of couriers and repeated clarifications, but through a direct, unbroken voice link. The battlefield began to behave like a single organism. German crews experiencing these engagements described American armored actions as inhumanly synchronized, or too coordinated to be mere chance. Officers in panzer divisions wrote reports claiming American tankers anticipated German maneuvers, pre-positioned before they could logically know German intentions, or responded as if reading from a shared playbook. But the Americans were not predicting the future. They were communicating the present at a speed the Germans could not match. This difference in tempo manifested brutally in firefights.
In a typical German armored engagement, the platoon leader would attempt to relay spotted threats through AM channels that might or might not cut through static. Followers often had to rely on visual cues. By the time the unit executed a coordinated shift, precious seconds had passed. In an American unit, those seconds did not exist. The moment a Sherman spotted an enemy gun position, the information traveled to the entire formation in one clear transmission: location, range, orientation, and recommended maneuver. Turrets swung in unison, nicht because of drill perfection, but because all crews heard the same order at the same instant. Prussian doctrine prized Auftragstaktik, decentralized initiative. American FM networks weaponized it. The U.S. created a system where lower-level initiative could flourish because lower-level units possessed the information required to act intelligently. Initiative without information is guesswork. Initiative with real-time coordination becomes lethal. The Germans found themselves in a paradox. Their army, trained for flexible command, was trapped inside a communication structure that strangled that flexibility. The Americans, supposedly rigid and overly hierarchical, created a battlefield where information flowed so freely that flexibility became their hallmark. Then came the most disruptive element of all: artillery integration. Before FM integration, artillery support required a delicate dance of maps, grids, relays, and repeated transmissions. AM-Radios oft machten dieses Prozess painlich slow. Observer hatten zu fighten distortion. Fire direction centers needed redundante confirmations. Weather konnte rendern entire sectors silent. Amerikanische FM-Netzwerke obliterierten diese constraints. Sherman commanders konnten call in fire mit shocking speed, sometimes adjusting rounds while still maneuvering. Artillery officers konnten rezivieren Korrekturen als naturally als listeners hören einen broadcast. A tank-infantry-artillery triad emerged. A triad, die Germans could not replicate, weil deren Technologie konnte nicht sustainen es. American armored thrusts no longer paused to arrange fire missions. They rolled, called, corrected and exploited. Alles in einem single-flowing motion. Zu German units unter fire, es empschien impossible, das Artillery responded so quickly. Many believed die Amerikaner hatten pre-registered the entire countryside. Andere assumed hidden forward observer wurden überall embedded. But the truth was simpler. FM clarity allowed fire missions to operate in real time. If a Sherman spotted a threat at 1502, artillery could be firing at 1503. If the situation changed by 1504, corrections arrived by 1504-30. The German system simply could not compress time this way. And time, in mechanized warfare, is deadly. The more battles the Germans fought against American FM-equipped forces, the more a grim realization spread through their ranks. Their assumptions about command superiority no longer applied. They were no longer fighting an army whose decisions emerged from the minds of officers. They were fighting a machine, a distributed, self-correcting, ever-communicating machine that transformed battlefield chaos into information. Technology had not replaced leadership. Technology had amplified it. In the end, it wasn't the sophistication of American engineering that stunned the Germans. It was the Americans' willingness to build a system where every tank, every vehicle, every platoon slot, and every combat element became a thinking node in a larger network. A network whose cohesion grew stronger the more units joined it. The Germans had expected the Americans to drown in their own size. Instead, the Americans used size to create a communication organism no European army had ever conceived. And by the time the Germans understood what they were facing, the FM network was everywhere, unbreakable, self-healing, and accelerating. For years, German officers had convinced themselves that American command was inherently chaotic, an army swollen with hastily trained soldiers, staffed by reservists, and incapable of the razor-sharp battlefield intuition that German doctrine prized. This belief wasn't just comforting, it was foundational. It reassured panzer commanders that, despite being outnumbered, they possessed a decisive edge in discipline, cohesion, and intellect. When the FM network shattered that illusion, the psychological impact spread faster than any tactical defeat. The first cracks appeared at the platoon level. Captured German tankers confessed to interrogators that American maneuver responses felt impossible to predict and faster than human. They described Sherman units adjusting positions before the Germans fully revealed their intentions, as if the Americans somehow understood their doctrine from the inside.
Ein Veteran-Panther-Commander, exhausted und bewildert, simpel sagte, "Die never hesitate, they move before we finish thinking." Das war mehr als Admiration, es war Dread. Because dread grows in the absence of explanation. German propaganda had painted the Americans als industrielle Amateure, lacking the spirit and instinct of master warriors. But the battlefield delivered a different reality. American units that didn't behave like individual formations, but like interconnected limbs of something larger, something silently intelligent. German soldiers tried to rationalize this contradiction. Some claimed the Americans had spies reporting their movements. Others insisted the US was using captured German radios. A few concocted fantasies of Allied commanders receiving real-time maps from reconnaissance planes.
Yet der Trud, die Existenz eines robusten, kristallkontrollierten FM-Kommunikationsarchitektur war so außerhalb deren doktrinellen Weltbild, dass many refused to accept it, even when shown captured sets. Das psychologische Brech diebte, als der Tempo der War akzelerierte. German battalion staffs reported feeling permanently behind the curve. Every American armored thrust felt premature, as if the US commanders couldn't possibly have synchronized infantry, tanks, tank destroyers und Artillerie so quickly. Divisional officers noted that their subordinates hesitated more often, not because they were less skilled, but because they no longer trusted their perception of the battlefield. When an enemy reacts with unnatural speed, every movement feels like a trap. This erosion of confidence proved far more damaging than any technical inferiority. In several after-action reports, German officers warned that Americans' communication swarms were creating cascading paralysis across the front.
Was die Waren beschreiben, ohne Unterstehen des Mechanismus, war der emergente Behavior von netzwerkter Combat. Ein Single Sherman spottete einen Treff, transmittierte Information instant zu seiner entire Cluster. Ein German Unit, encounteren diese synchrone Reaktion repetiert, interpretierte es nicht als Kommunikation, sondern als Prämeditation. Der beliebte, die Amerikaner waren always warten für sie. But der most profounde psychological blow kam von kultureller Dissonanz. Deutsche Soldaten gehörten zu einer Armee, die exaltierte den Genies Commander, den inspirierten Leader, der siehst Initiative an dezisive Momente. Deren Doktrin centerte auf Human Brillanz. Amerikanische FM-Netzwerke replacten das romantische Ideal mit Sonnters kalter, systemische Intelligenz. Decisions nun länger hinken auf einem einzigen Officers Intuition, sondern auf einer Battlefield-wide Consensus, Bild von Tausenden von synchronisierten Datenpunkten. Für Germans trained zu belieben war eine Art, nicht eine Komputation, dies war almost heretisch.
Their frustration grew into resentment. How could an army built on assembly lines, crewed by farmers, clerks, mechanics, outmaneuver units forged in centuries of military tradition? How could mass-produced tanks, derided as crude and undergunned, respond with more precision than elite panzer formations? How could officers who didn't grow up studying the General Stab's sacred texts outperform those who lived inside that world? Many frontline officers avoided confronting the real answer. The Americans had changed the definition of command. Some German memoirs from 1944 to 45 reveal a quiet, creeping despair. Panzer commanders began reporting a sense of fighting underwater, where every movement felt slow and muffled compared to the American swift coherence. Junior officers took fewer risks, not because they were afraid of the enemy's guns, but because they were afraid of the enemy's information. Surprise attacks that once defined German tactics now failed with humiliating consistency, intercepted not by scouts, but by an entire network listening simultaneously. Even the myth von German radio discipline collapsed. German soldiers prided themselves on professionalism, but their AM radios betrayed them in moments of crisis. Static garbled urgent messages. Frequency drift severed commands mid-sentence. Interference forced units to repeat everything twice, sometimes 3 times. With every failed transmission, morale suffered. With every crackling message drowned by engine noise, confidence eroded. Meanwhile, American voices across the line continued sounding calm, clear, and impossibly coordinated. The psychological battlefield was now asymmetrical. The Americans fought inside a bubble of clarity. The Germans fought inside a fog. And once doubt took hold, once panzer crews began to believe the Americans possessed an almost supernatural coordination, the collapse became self-sustaining. Movement slowed, initiative faltered, attacks hesitated. Units that once prided themselves on fluidity devolved into rigid formations, afraid to stretch too far lest the invisible American network envelop them again. Morale didn't break all at once. It leaked out gradually. Every time an American armored thrust arrived too soon. Every time artillery fell too precisely. Every time a Sherman platoon pivoted too perfectly. By the final winter of the war, many German officers no longer feared American firepower. They feared American communication. Because firepower can be survived, but an enemy that reacts faster than you can think, that is an enemy that unravels your will. As the war ground toward its final months, German commanders struggled to articulate the force that had undone them. They could point to American factories, American fuel reserves, American manpower, but these explanations felt incomplete. Something deeper had shifted on the battlefield, something that defied the old equations of armor thickness, gun penetration, and troop quality. In after-action interrogations, senior officers groped for language. They coordinated too fast. Their reactions were unnatural. Their command decisions traveled like lightning. But the truth was not supernatural. It was infrastructural. The United States had reinvented the role of communication in warfare, not as a support function, but as an independent axis of power. The FM network that pulsed through every Sherman crew, every armored scout, every artillery liaison, and every combined arms formation created a new form of military intelligence, collective, distributed, immediate. It allowed the American army to maneuver at tempos the German doctrine had never imagined. It transformed battalion-level decisions into real-time choices. And it turned every tank on the battlefield into a listening post, a command relay, a tactical sensor, and a node of shared situational awareness. German generals had prepared to fight men. They had not prepared to fight a system. And in the crucible of mechanized warfare, systems win. The legacy of this transformation extended far beyond 1945. The American insistence on clean, resilient, scalable communication became the blueprint for post-war doctrine around the world. Armies that once worshipped the lone brilliant commander now restructured themselves around the flow of information.
The idea that clarity could be mass-produced, distributed, and weaponized reshaped NATO command philosophy, Cold War planning, and eventually the very foundations of modern network-centric warfare. The seeds of today's digitally integrated battlefields, drones feeding live reconnaissance, armored brigades moving with synchronized autonomy, artillery striking targets seconds after detection, were planted in the moment the United States decided that every Sherman should carry a crystal-controlled FM radio. The Germans learned this lesson too late, but their reflections left a haunting epitaph. One captured panzer commander, asked what he feared most about American armor, didn't mention the Sherman's mobility, or its turret speed, or its numerical advantage. He paused, as if searching for the correct words, then answered quietly, "They always knew more than we did. By the time we understood the battlefield, they had already acted." That was the final, unbridgeable gap. In a war often mythologized as a contest of steel and spirit, the true battleground lay in the silent frequencies that connected American crews into a single cognitive engine. While German strategists measured divisions, the Americans measured bandwidth. While German planners trusted intuition, the Americans trusted clarity. And while German armor fought as isolated formations, American armor fought as a network. The outcome was not merely victory. It was the dawn of a new era, one where the side that speaks clearly, quickly, and relentlessly shapes the tempo of war itself. For all the legends of tanks, aces, and battlefield heroics, the quieter truth remained. World War II was decided not only by firepower, but by communication. And the FM radio, simple, rugged, mass-produced, was the ghost in the Sherman's turret that changed the fate of armored warfare forever.